Good morning. My name is Mary Meg McCarthy, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Immigrant Justice Center. And I am thrilled to welcome all of you to our webinar entitled False Friction, Reconciling COVID-19 with Immigrants' Rights. We encourage you to ask your questions via the chat box, and we will address them at the end of the presentation today. Our agenda today is to provide you with an understanding of what's happening in the immigration refugee system. Our refugee system was created post-World War II pursuant to the UN Convention on Refugees and the 1980 Refugee Act. As a nation, we have a legal obligation domestically and internationally to not, I repeat, not return people to a place where they risk persecution. Today, you will hear from our policy and direct service experts on how the executive branch is using the public health crisis to undermine our legal obligations and access to human rights protections. Border closures have little to no effect on virus spread. They are almost always too late and have too many exclusions to be effective. What is happening in our neighboring countries is happening here in the US. The virus has no borders. This morning we will discuss the legality of the border closing, the impact recent policies are having on vulnerable populations, including children, LGBT individuals, and families. Finally, you will hear about our efforts at the National Immigrant Justice Center to provide access to justice for clients who are subjected to the cruel and illegal policies and trapped in an immigration detention system that creates higher risk every day for their well-being and their health. We will also share ways that you, our NIJC community, can get involved, and of course, there will be time to answer your questions. Let me just tell you briefly and introduce you to the National Immigrant Justice Center. For more than 30 years, NIJC has worked to protect human rights, advance due process, and justice for immigrants and refugees. We work in 5 cities with a staff of 125 and more than 2,000 committed pro bono attorneys throughout the country. NIJC is unique in that we draw on our direct legal services to more than 13,000 immigrants, refugees, and their families to advance systemic reform. We engage in strategic litigation, advocacy at the federal, state, and local levels, and public education. It is that unique blend that advances protections and the human rights protections that are so critical now more than ever for our neighbors, our brothers and sisters. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker, next speaker, our Senior Policy Analyst at the National Immigrant Justice Center, Azadeh Afrani, who will begin our conversation. But before I do, I just want to make sure you all stay with us to the very bitter end, because it will be so important that you're part of our discussion and that you continue to be that in that discussion. On June 2nd, we have our virtual Human Rights Awards, and at that time you will have another opportunity to learn about the work that we and our awardees are doing in advancing protection. So Azadeh, without further ado, thank you.
Thank you, Mary Megan. Thank you all for giving attention to the intersection of this pandemic with immigrant rights this morning. So I'll be speaking on one particular angle, which is how this administration has taken advantage of the public health crisis that we face today to move forward on a long-standing project, namely to close the southern border. So how did this happen? I think that's really where we should start, and when did this happen? Because there's so many things happening with COVID-19, sometimes it's hard to remember all of the different steps that have been taken so far. So on March 20th, the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, issued an order and an interim final rule to suspend the entry of non-citizens, with the exception of U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, the military, and their relatives at the northern and the southern border. This order was valid for 1 month and was recently extended until May 20th. But even as late as yesterday, we were hearing from reports from the media that this order is likely to be extended indefinitely as we near May 20th. So it's important to emphasize that this is really the first time in US history that such a measure has been taken. We've been through pandemics before. There's been 4 in the past century, but the US has never closed its border in this way, and it's never used the particular statute that it has appealed to in order to seal the border as of March 20th. So the particular statute is on this slide, and it is the Public Health Service Act of 1944, a statute that precedes a lot of the protections that Mary Meg mentioned early on in terms of the asylum protections that were implemented in the second part of the century. The statute says explicitly that the Surgeon General shall have the power to prohibit, in whole or in part, the introduction of persons or property in the United States, and for any such period as he shall deem necessary. Before we delve into the legal justification, or really lack thereof, of the use of this statute, it's important to note that the CDC relied on representations of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, to say that basically the only solution here is to seal the border, because alternatively we would have to detain everybody who entered. That is a false assumption, because the reality is that there are many alternatives that include community care options and release through parole that are sound alternatives in this public health crisis in order to safely process individuals without putting them in detention centers where the disease will spread more quickly and in a more deadly manner, and as it would in any congregate setting. So essentially, the CDC pulled the statute from 1944 and at the same time relied on a representation that only detention was the alternative in order to make this unprecedented and drastic move. So moving on to the next slide, what does this mean, right, on a legal basis? Is this actually a legal thing to do, to seal the border in this manner? So it's important to know that the Public Health Service Act of 1944 is actually not an immigration-related statute, right? It doesn't give any authority to the CDC to interfere with our immigration laws, to superpose or really add a new immigration procedure to how we process individuals at the border. The Public Health Service Act was drafted as a quarantine law, really in response to diseases like smallpox and cholera. And there's a really compelling article that I recommend folks consult, which is written by a former senior counselor to the DHS secretary, Lucas Gutentag. And he did a deep dive into the rationale for suspending the introduction of persons and not immigrants or non-citizens. So essentially, this article is in your resources, but it explains that Congress considered the possibility of making this about non-citizens and not persons, which is what the statute explicitly says. And it rejected that because it said it was discriminatory and it didn't make public health sense, right? because the virus doesn't know nationality, it doesn't know citizenship status. And so as with respect to determining quarantine policies, it didn't make sense to only have this law apply to individuals on the basis of their citizenship status. So the statute was never contemplated really as a backdoor way to regulate immigration, but this administration has used it far beyond its design and purpose. The second reason we should be very suspicious of the legality of this border closure is that there are literally decades of legislation that followed the Public Health Service Act of 1944. So as Mary Mag mentioned at the beginning, there was the Refugee Act of 1980, which ironically celebrated its 40th anniversary on the same month as the border was sealed in March. And this act enshrined the historic policy of the United States to respond to the urgent needs of persons subject to persecution in their homeland. So what the Refugee Act did is essentially it provided a pathway for any person who present themselves at the border to seek asylum in the United States. Also, there are international measures, international instruments that have been that are binding on the United States, including the UN Protocol for relating to the status on refugees and the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, both of which have been essentially incorporated into US law, which means that they are just as binding as a statute that is passed by Congress. So CBP, or Customs and Border Protection, is prohibited under US and international law to return asylum seekers to the conditions that they just fled that are life-threatening on the basis of a protected ground. That means that by suspending these laws, by essentially ignoring the binding US and international protections, the border closure is unlawful. It's also unlawful with respect to torture survivors because over 2 decades ago, the US became a party to the Convention Against Torture. And Article 3 of the Convention Against Torture states that no state party, including the United States, shall expel, return, or extradite a person to another state where there are substantial grounds for believing that they would be a danger of being subjected to torture. And very recently, the UN Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture has explicitly stated that this protection of Article 3 of the Convention Against Torture cannot be foregone under the current pandemic. So just because there's a public health crisis happening, it doesn't suspend that law either. And last but not least, Congress unanimously passed protection for unaccompanied immigrant children in 2008. So just as a reminder, in recent history, I can't think of many laws that have been passed unanimously. This is one of them. It had bipartisan support from Congress, and it essentially created a very strict line of procedures for unaccompanied children who present themselves at the border. Among those procedures is the fact that children must be turned over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement within 72 hours of their apprehension by Customs and Border Patrol. This strict 72-hour deadline means that children have to be essentially transferred out of of the detention centers of CBP, and they have to be sent for safe processing and to an agency that's going to look out for their best interests and expedited safe release to their sponsors or parents. Additionally, the Trafficking Victim Protection and Reauthorization Act, the TVPRA, only permits the return of children to their country of origin after 3 separate agencies, the Department of Homeland Security, the Office of Refugee Resettlement and the Department of State have reviewed to ensure that the child will be safely repatriated and reunited with their family or child welfare agency. So all of these protection measures are in the books, are on the laws, and nonetheless, they have been ignored or suspended because of this border closure. So in the next slide, we really are looking at the impact of this border closure, and the impact is really breathtaking. Basically, this order has opened the door for Customs and Border Protection to create two tracks. They have weaponized the CDC's order to create what they've called Title 42 expulsions. Title 42 just refers to the statute of the Public Health Service Act. And then they have essentially created a second track for all of the decades of legislation that we just talked about, which are under Title 8 of the US Code. And those are Title 8 apprehensions. And if you're interested, there is a resource towards the end of the resource packet that you have from Customs and Border Protection that essentially tracks those two forms of expulsions and apprehensions and shows you the staggering figure that over 20,000 people have been expelled under the CDC's order because of how Customs and Border Protection has interpreted this statute as authorizing them to just turn people away and return them straight back to the conditions that they fled. This includes countless asylum seekers, torture survivors, and children. And frankly, we don't know what has happened to those folks, right? That's really the tragedy here. We don't know the harm that they have had to face, the danger that they've been subjected to, and including the public health risk that they have been forced to face because of these summary expulsions. But we do know that returning them to the place that they fled is a blatant violation of US and international law. And it's not just happening every day, it's happening indefinitely, from what it sounds like in terms of the extension of this order. So what you see on the right side of the chart, on the right side of the slide, is a chart of cases processed by the US Citizenship and Immigration Services that essentially screens individuals who have expressed a credible fear of return. And in other words, people who are potential asylum seekers. And as you can see, the numbers used to be in the thousands, 4,000, 6,000 individuals, and they have plummeted to 229 in the month of April. That speaks to how many people, the countless lives that we've turned away at the border because of this border closure. And it also means that CBP has returned children who have traveled alone to seek safety from violence, trafficking, persecution, straight back to the conditions that they fled. So remember, we talked about how the TVPRA, the law that Congress passed unanimously in 2008, mandates that Customs and Border agents turn over children to the Office of Refugee Resettlement within 72 hours. In the month of March, that procedure happened to 1,852 children for the entire month. And remember, as of March 20th, the border was sealed, so that short-circuited even that procedure. But nearly 2,000 children were turned over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement in March. That figure again plummeted to 58 children for the entire month of April. Think about all of the children, right, that have been exposed to harm because of these policies. The other point, which my colleague Lisa is going to delve into more deeply, is that there are literally tens of thousands of people who are waiting for their day in court under the Program Migrant Protection Protocol, or MPP. They're stranded in Mexico, and the US government has essentially shut the door on their face once again, indefinitely delaying their court dates, imposing travel to the border when it's unnecessary, and all of these things that essentially have further increased the risk of harm and danger for them on a daily basis, which again, Lisa will discuss more in detail. So what has been the public health response? That's the next thing that I'd like to take a look at. And the public health response has really been unequivocal. I know it's hard to wrap your head around this sometimes because it's the CDC, right, who came up with this order, but it's important to know that the public health expert community has been really unanimous in terms of denouncing this and saying that there is no logic, no public health rationale for closing the border on asylum seekers, on torture survivors, or on children. So Doctors Without Borders, Physicians with Human Rights, and most recently over 700 doctors have sent a letter to the CDC director rejecting their representation that closing the border actually promotes public health. I highly recommend the article that is linked here, and that's also in your resources, that talks through how there is really no public health rationale for closing the border in the first place. And it's a bit odd to have to say this, right? But COVID-19 doesn't care about citizenship status. So doctors know this, and they understand and see through the fact that this is an ideological debate, really. This is about denouncing once again immigrants as the problem, violating decades of legislation, and distracting us from responding to the crisis that this country has faced and that has led to tens of thousands of lives lost because of this government's response. So there is no doubt that public health screenings or health screenings are advised in this situation, but there is no reason to return people to harm and to wall off asylum seekers and children. And experts have said time and time again that public health measures only work when they include everyone. That includes the migrants who are fleeing violence and harm and seeking lawful protection at our borders. In terms of NIJC's response, we have been developing lots of materials for increasing public knowledge because of the flood of information that we are all faced with under COVID-19, right? It's hard to keep track of everything that's going on and to really wrap our heads around how blatant of a human rights violation this border closure has been. So we've developed a frequently asked question that is in your material that spells out why this is unlawful. We've also created materials. Every 2 weeks we send a biweekly newsletter to members of Congress to educate them about the impact that this is having on asylum seekers and children because of the border closure on a regular basis. We've also developed a response that has, in our press release and in a regulatory comment submitted to the CDC, we have denounced and called for the rescission of this border closure in the strongest possible terms. This is really, we're trying to build a record in terms of how this is neither the public health community nor the human rights community can find any justification for this border closure. And we've contributed to letters from different partner organizations and worked with members of Congress on oversight letters to hold Customs and Border Patrol accountable and to really ask for answers as to what is happening to the adults and children and families who are impacted by these border closures. So without further ado, I think we should turn over to Lisa in terms of looking at the impact on direct legal services as well.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Coop. I work very closely with NIJC's asylum projects, and for the last 2 years, that's meant doing a lot of work down along the southern border with asylum seekers who are appearing and previously were held in immigration detention at a skyrocketing rate. And more recently, were subjected to the migrant protection protocols or the Remain in Mexico program. And Ellen, I want to hang out on the slide just for a moment here because I want to describe what you're seeing here, which is the bridge between Nuevo Laredo, Mexico and Laredo, Texas, which is the place where NIJC has really focused its work responding to the migrant protection protocols. And also we found ourselves working with a lot of separated mothers who were held in immigration detention in the Laredo area. And I know there are a lot of people on this call who have expertise in these areas. I noticed a number of our colleagues from ProBar, who I know have been on the front lines of this work down there in Harlingen and Brownsville. And I do hope that you all will enter your questions into the chat box, because I think, and your comments, because I know there are a lot of faith leaders and grassroots organizers and pro bono attorneys and legal experts who are with us today, who have a lot to add to this conversation. And we would love to be able to benefit from your experience and your comments. So please feel free to weigh in. And I wanted to just take a moment to talk about what does the sealing of the border mean for the people who were already collected south of the border in this Remain in Mexico program, which was an unabated chaotic catastrophe from day one. You know, it has been, just one human rights violation after another for the people that have been subjected to that program in every way. And also the people who have been forced to remain in immigration detention. None of these things are necessary. As a nation, we are very capable of responding to asylum seekers in an orderly and organized and humane fashion. And we're able to assess asylum claims in a way that doesn't involve violating the human rights and the due process rights of asylum seekers. And it's heartbreaking to see where we are today and the extent to which this administration has used a public health crisis to harm immigrants. They've politicized what should be an effort that we should, as a nation, be responding to collectively, and instead have made it a political issue, and has, as Azadeh said, have really weaponized it and used it against immigrants. So if we can hop to the next slide, this is what we saw immediately around the time our nation was awakening to the dangers of COVID, was a real disconnect between the messaging on one level saying, hey, we have to seal the border. We can't let these asylum seekers in because they're necessarily going to bring COVID in a way that's uncontrollable. And that was in tension with the way we were seeing asylum seekers treated at the border in terms of MPP. So the last time I was down in Texas was the third week of March. And we were representing clients who had their asylum merits hearings in MPP. So these were people that had been forced to wait in Nuevo Laredo, Mexico. And the client I was representing had been subjected to kidnapping and sexual assault by cartels while she had been waiting to have her case heard. And she was desperate to move forward with her proceedings. And so we very much felt this tension in wanting to press forward and have her day in court and have a judge adjudicate her claim measured against this very real threat that we recognize. And when we went into the facility, you can see the door there at the bottom. It's a very welcoming, regal entrance to a court of law. That's how you enter the Migrant Protection Court, or the MPP court in Laredo, Texas. And we tried to press the government to take some safety measures to protect our clients, to protect themselves, to protect us, and to a person that was refused. And so we were forced, you can see there that collection of what looked like shipping containers and tents. Those are the MPP courts. So those little boxes are the merits hearing courts. And I know a lot of you have handled immigration merits hearings in the immigration court, some of you in the Chicago Immigration Court. Well, this is where we hold our trials down in Laredo, Texas. And even though some of these big tent spaces were available, and we were asking, can we at least go into these spaces where we have, the ability to social distance? Can we at least make sure that we're cleaning these spaces before we're proceeding with our hearings? It was absolutely no. And we were required to sit in those shipping containers for 4 hours in an enclosed space. And thankfully, nobody got sick. But to suggest that there was this, very real concern on one level that was leading the administration to seal the border while at the same time people were being forced to go forward in these proceedings. And I understand in Harlingen to this day, attorneys are being forced to go into courts to represent their clients in the detention centers. And we're certainly seeing that in Chicago, where our hearings are proceeding, and at this point, our attorneys are appearing telephonically. But there is this real disconnect between actual care for the public health risk that people are facing and the reality on the ground. And so there was just this inherent contradiction in using COVID to justify sealing the border while continuing to subject asylum seekers to that risk. Now, these hearings in MPP have been suspended, but people who are subject to the migrant protection protocols, who are remaining in Mexico, are nonetheless still required to travel to the border to pick up their hearing notices. So, and there's been some mixed messaging on this, and I'll take a moment to explain it. In order to be a part of the MPP program, to comply with the requirements of the government, there are three components that take place south of the border in Mexico for people that are forced to remain in Mexico. When people go back into Mexico, the Border Patrol gives them what they call tear sheets. So these are these documents that say, hey, in case you didn't already know this, you are in MPP and you must remain in Mexico for your proceedings. And then the second document they receive is an immigration court hearing notice. And that hearing notice tells you when your court hearing is. And in the normal world in the United States, where asylum seekers provide the immigration court with an address, they can be mailed a change of address or a change of a hearing date and time to their address, or their attorneys can receive it on their behalf. But because people who are forced to remain in Mexico are living in shelters, they're living on the streets, they're transient, they're in tent encampments, they don't have a physical address to receive these mailers. So there's no real way for the government to communicate, at least by mail, these notices to people. Now, understandably, many people could access this information through a telephone number, or online systems could be set up, and some do exist, but thus far the courts have been suggesting that people need to receive these physical documents. And then the third component of Remain in Mexico is the visa that you get from Mexico that allows you to stay there. And there is concern among people that are subject to MPP that if those visas expire, then they could be deported from Mexico. Or on a more practical level, and perhaps a more likely level, if you're staying, as many of our clients are, outside of Nuevo Laredo, because it's not safe to stay in Nuevo Laredo, and you found, for example, a safe place to live in Monterrey, Mexico, which is a few hours away, our clients buy bus tickets from Monterrey to Nuevo Laredo to travel in. Well, the bus services won't sell you a ticket unless you can demonstrate that you have a valid Mexican visa. And so if you don't get that visa extension, which is tied to your hearing notice and your tear sheet, then you can't extend your Mexican visa in order to travel and get your bus ticket and remain safely, to the extent that you're safe, in Mexico. And so our clients have really been grappling with the fact that through a lot of advocacy, we've reached the point where the Border Patrol has told us, more or less, probably if you don't have that tear sheet, if you find out that your court hearing has been continued because courts have been suspended in light of COVID, they're probably going to let you back in for your hearing if you show up on that date. And the courts have suggested to us that in all likelihood, yeah, if you show up without that hearing notice, you're probably still going to be allowed to continue with your proceedings. So if you manage to find out when your court date is by using that court hotline number, or by getting online, or because you have an attorney, which only about 2% or fewer people in MPP have attorneys. So again, this access to counsel question is very significant in this context, as it is in all others. Even though you probably will be able to get back into court, you might not be able to travel to your court hearing the night before if you don't have that Mexican visa extension. And our clients have just struggled immensely, and I know so many others have as well, trying to figure out how they get this visa extension. So for example, we have a client, Manuel, who's out in Monterrey, who has what most of us would consider a textbook asylum case. He's a gay man from Venezuela. He was a political dissident. He has what should be an open and closed asylum claim. He had excellent evidence. We appeared with him in court back in January, And the government, as they have been doing in every asylum case, fought us tooth and nail on this hearing. They decided this was one they were going to contest. And so we used up all the time that we had reserved for our merits hearing, and the judge continued us. The judge didn't issue a decision. So poor Manuel, instead of winning his case and being able to come into the United States and receive protection, had to travel back to Monterey, where he's been waiting and is now subject to these court continuances. And his hearing won't take place until, at this point, the end of July, if the courts are reopened at that point. So he's living in quarantine. He's lost his job. He has no way to earn money. And he can't get his visa extended because he can't travel to the border. And he tried yesterday. We did get word from the Mexican government that, oh no, it is possible to go to a different port of entry or to go to a different Mexican migration office and get your visa extended. And he tried to go to the office in Monterey and was told, oh, sorry, that's not actually how it works. You have to go out to the airport. Well, there's no public transportation running in Monterey, and he has no money and no vehicle and no way to get that visa extended. And so this ongoing difficulty, which just feels logistical but has such substantive consequences for our clients, is ongoing. And I want to shift to the next slide, which is our client Vanessa, who made the trip from Monterey. She also was living in hiding in Monterey. And she made the trip into Nuevo Laredo because she decided she couldn't risk having her Mexican visa expire because she's a single mom and she has 3 daughters. And she needs to be able to travel in for her merits hearing, even though she's terrified to do so when that time comes. And she was faced with a really difficult decision because she was aware, she lives in a shelter in Monterey, that the shelter for public health reasons was saying, hey, if you leave the shelter, you can't come back in because you might be infected. And so she was faced with this really horrible decision of risking losing her visa and being at risk of not being able to remain in Mexico and potentially losing her housing. So we asked her to record a voice memo of what her experience was when she actually did decide to travel to the border last week. And Ellen's going to play that now. And this is, a bit of a representation of Vanessa and her daughters that they sent us. So Ellen, let's see if we'll hear Vanessa in Spanish. And if you can read the slide, you'll see the translation in English.
Mm-hmm. 1 second, we're getting this going. Sorry.
Todo fue muy difícil hasta para comprar los boletos y todo. Tenían que estarnos chequeando y no podían ir muchas personas en el autobús. Aparte, la policía tenía que estar escoltando el autobús cuando llegamos allá a la estación del bus también para ingresar y todo era difícil. Para salir también del albergue era difícil porque con eso del coronavirus, si uno salía, en especial para ir a la frontera, les dijeron que no podían regresar porque se podían contagiar con el virus y traer y contagiar a las demás personas que estaban acá. También en migración casi no estaban atendiendo las personas y no nos dejaban entrar a la sala a esperar porque no podían estar las personas juntas y en Laredo es peligroso estar afuera, pero teníamos que estar allá afuera y tener una distancia de las personas, 1 metro de distancia por el contagio del virus. Entonces todo era como bien complicado, aparte cuando llegué también a la terminal de autobuses. Fue como bien difícil porque estaban unas personas preguntando si uno tenía un permiso una clave para circular en Laredo. Y, o sea, tampoco todas las personas tienen esa clave y si no tienen la clave, entonces está expuesto para que lo secuestren y tenga que pagar por esa clave para poder circular. Entonces todo era como bien complicado. Y no quería tampoco exponer mis hijas y llevarlas para que no fueran a contagiarse. Entonces no sabía qué hacer y fue difícil dejarlas porque yo estaba sola acá y no tenía quien me las va a cuidar. Entonces tampoco podía llevarla y era difícil porque tampoco tenía como la seguridad de que iba a regresar bien, y si no regresaba bien no las iba a poder ver, entonces todo era muy difícil.
So you hear her discussing all of those challenges and the fact that, you know, despite the pandemic, the cartels are still out in full force in the bus stations. And as they were arriving, they were being asked to provide their code. And this code it means that you've already paid extortion fees to the cartels. And if you haven't, then you're, you know, potentially subject to being kidnapped and extorted. And so it was a really harrowing journey for her. And thankfully, she was able to make it to Nuevo Laredo and back in the shelter. Did allow her to re-enter. And so far, you know, she's been healthy, but it was certainly a terrifying experience for her. So the next slide just shifts us a little bit to north of the border to people who are stuck in immigration detention. And the number on our slide is actually low. As of last night, there were 9,043 positive cases of COVID in immigration detention. And public health experts describe this as a tinderbox. There is no way to protect immigrants who are in immigration detention. And, you know, DHS officials from prior administrations have gone on record saying, look, there's a really easy solution to this. Nearly everybody who's in immigration detention is there at the discretion of the Department of Homeland Security. People can be released, and our government is choosing not to release them. And that, of course, has deadly consequences. We've seen COVID death in Otay Mesa and San Diego, and we're likely to see more given these numbers and the unique vulnerabilities that many non-citizens contend with while in immigration. The next slide references our client M, who we're representing in her habeas proceedings before the Western District of Texas. And I saw that we have some colleagues from Raices on the line, and Raices was gracious enough to co-counsel in our habeas action on this. So we've been very grateful for that. And we're working with a pro bono attorney from Barnes and Thornburg who contacted us early in the pandemic and said, hey, I want to help. What can I do? How can I get involved? And he didn't have any habeas experience, but said he was going to jump in and you know, we're doing our best to get this poor mother out of detention. She's a woman. The pictures before you are pictures of other separated moms. We don't have a picture of this client because she's been in jail for as long as we've known her. Her case represents the really tragic confluence of many of the efforts by this administration to punish asylum seekers and foreclose their ability to seek protection. And so she experienced family separation from her two children in April of last year. So she's been apart from her children for over a year, and she's a survivor of really significant trauma. And she was denied asylum by an immigration judge, in large part because of the changes we've seen to the asylum system and the real effort to find a way to deny protection to every asylum seeker, particularly those who are in detention. And in our experience, particularly those who are in the Texas jails where we've provided representation. So she's suffered prolonged detention. She's been detained for over a year now. And while detained, she was diagnosed with hepatitis B, which is a liver condition and one that the CDC recognizes as something that creates added vulnerability when it comes to COVID-19. And so as we came to appreciate the real danger that she, along with other immigration detainees, faced, we requested again her release. This was our third request for parole for her. And we had intervention, 2 member level calls earlier from Ayanna Presley, who tried to advocate on her behalf, and more recently Jan Schakowsky, you know, made a call to the field office director to say, hey, this is a case that you should take a closer look at. This is a woman who you should consider releasing from detention. And the answer across the board has been no. Like we are committed to keeping her detained. And so we filed a habeas corpus action on her behalf on April the 22nd, and have been litigating that case. She was detained in Pearsall, Texas, and very soon after we filed our habeas, she was moved from Pearsall to Laredo, Texas, where she had actually been previously. And so they're kind of moving her around as if to suggest that the issue is the facility perhaps that she's in, and not the fact that any immigration detention is intolerable under these conditions. and she can't be safe anywhere. There are no measures that they are capable of taking that will keep her safe and will keep other immigrant detainees safe. And so we are in the midst of that litigation and filing our response this week. So I'll return to that when we're done with our conversation here. And we'll continue our efforts to try and get our clients out of detention. And I know so many people on this call have been playing a role in the response, including many of our faith leaders and church partners who have offered to provide, to sponsor, provide shelter, provide housing to immigrants who are in detention. I think oftentimes the government suggests there's a real binary choice between keeping people in jail or releasing them into the world in an unsafe way, and that's simply not the case. We've seen such an outpouring of support from organizations who say, you know, in M's case in particular, there's a hospitality house in San Antonio that stepped up and said, we have space for her, we'll take care of her, we'll connect her with medical care, we'll host her children, we'll make sure that she's able to quarantine and do this safely. And so again, just the messaging out of the Department of Homeland Security that immigrants are inherently dangerous and there's no safe way to both protect public health and protect asylum seekers is simply a fallacy. So with that, we wanted to protect some time for questions, and Ellen is going to share a little bit about opportunities for you to get involved. Again, I know many of you are already, but maybe additional steps that you may wish to take while you collect your questions, and then we can have some time for conversation at the end.
Great. Well, thank you, Mary Meg, Azadeh, and Lisa, and for all of those attending. You've shown up, and that's the first step of staying informed. So we really appreciate you being here with us today. Lots of information was shared, and probably a lot of emotions stirred during that presentation as well. What better to do with emotions than to turn them into actions? So I wanted to just spend a minute or two on what can you do. We're getting some questions already about what can be done, different parts of the country and from different types of groups. And so I will say too that the presentation is being recorded, and we will share this afterwards, and we can also share the slide deck. So thank you for asking that question. And as Azadeh mentioned also during her talk, her discussion, there is information in your handouts. So on the right-hand side of your screen are two handouts. One is a resource list comprised of a number of resources, a variety of resources from our NIJC, the FAQ, the comments, the press releases, and our new report on justice-free zones that was released with ACLU and Human Rights First, I believe. And then we have external sources also. Azadeh mentioned a number of them. And then the two links also from DHS. So check that out. Feel free to share them. We will be sending them around in an email. And then the second page there is what you can do. And so I'd like to just briefly go through this and just say, what can you do? First and foremost, well, I'm the pro bono manager, so I'll start here. If you are an attorney, you have great skills of being able to navigate the legal system, and you speak English. And so for a lot of our clients, it's already a good step up. If you can take a case. Today, we've talked a lot about what's going on the border, but as NIJC initiated in Chicago, and we have offices in Chicago and Indiana, we have more than 50 cases that need representation right now. And by you taking one of these cases, it frees up a lot of our NIJ expertise to be able to respond in these emergency situations. So we appreciate all that our pro bono partners are doing, and we encourage you, please check out the list of cases that we have that really need representation right now. Secondly, if you're not a lawyer, that is okay too. There are so many ways to get involved. It really takes a village. And so on this sheet of what you can do, there are ways that you can help free people from immigration jail in terms of supporting the individuals, donating to the emergency fund, volunteer language services. We need interpreters and translators. There's a link there, and ways to contact your members of Congress and your representatives. And so those are ways that you can take direct action. And if you don't think it matters, it really does. Every drop in the bucket helps us getting closer to spilling over. And so that's what we need to do, and we appreciate your support. There's also ways to know your rights and continue to get information such as you got today. As Azadeh mentioned, our teams have worked really hard to put together FAQs and other types of informational flyers to get out information that is updated and active and supports human rights and the dignity and security of individuals. So we ask you to stay in touch that way and to share those resources. Finally, and what is most exciting is that on June 2nd, where we normally have our luncheon, due to these circumstances, we're changing our luncheon to a virtual happy hour. So we hope that you all can join us for this exciting happy hour. And we are going to be celebrating our human rights champions. We will be celebrating with our pro bono partners and with a number of clients, and just it'll be a great celebration. And so we appreciate that you could join us there. And even if you can't join us, if you'd be able to donate, this is where we do, earn a lot of our funding for the year. And considering the circumstances, we do expect to take a slight hit in our finances. And so we appreciate your support there. There is a link available in this What You Can Do document, and we'll be sure to include it in the follow-up email. So without further ado, I don't know if anybody else, Azadeh, Lisa, or Mary Meg had any other ideas about how to get involved. And if not, then I'm going to jump into some of the questions. We have lots of questions, and it looks like we have just about 10 minutes. We want to respect your time here. So if we don't get to your questions orally on this presentation, then we'll do so in a follow-up email with whoever is best to answer that question. And so we have a number of questions, let's see here, about different parts of the country. And a lot of what we can do. I'm just going to start with, there are some questions about how to talk to and how to, let's see here, sorry, I missed this last question where I'm at. Actually, let's just get back into a little bit of the border. So Lisa, I'm going to direct this one towards you. We have had other presentations and we work a lot about kind of what's happening at the border. And there's a question about the intersection of MPP and some of the third-party agreements that we're hearing about. Would you be able to comment anything about the timing of the third-party country agreements with Guatemala, the metering, MPP? Would you be able to talk about that and who makes those decisions?
Sure. In the lead up to the pandemic, this administration had sort of taken a scattershot approach to, trying a whole bunch of different things to shut down asylum. And that included MPP, which when it first started, we thought was, wow, this was the worst thing that they could possibly do to asylum seekers. And as has been the reality throughout this administration, we underestimated the cruelty of our current government, because in addition to MPP, they started other programs through which asylum seekers were afforded even fewer rights to put forth a claim. So some of those programs were expedited asylum processing claims where individuals were taken into custody rather than being, sent back into MPP, whether that was directly after appearing at the border or after having been metered. So one of the first things that we saw the government start to do was say, hey, America's full, we can't process you at the border. We're going to put your name on a list. And you can come back in a couple of days or a couple of weeks or a couple of months and put forth your request for asylum at that point. And that's referred to as metering. And metering has been really problematic for a lot of reasons, not the least of which is a set of rules that the government put forth that are known as the transit ban, that says anybody who entered the United States after January 16th isn't eligible for asylum at all. You can only apply for a lesser form of protection called withholding of removal unless you can show that you applied for asylum somewhere else on your way to the United States. That's not how the law works. That's not a legal interpretation of the law, but unfortunately, it's been allowed to go forward in place up until now. And so you have people subject to the transit ban, people who were metered, who presented themselves before July 16th and are now being told, oh, sorry, because your final date of coming in was after that, you're subject to this additional rule. And then on top of that, you have to remain in Mexico under MPP. And then there are people who don't even get that far, people who are taken immediately into custody and are given in name what's known as a credible fear interview. So this provisional or preliminary interview that's supposed to help identify people that have, it's a really low threshold. Like if you have a semblance of an asylum case and it seems like you're going to be likely to put forth an asylum claim, then we're going to let you go forward with that claim. We're going to allow you to apply for asylum instead of summarily deporting you. And what's happening to the people in those expedited programs is they have zero access to attorneys, or very little. I think some folks at ProBar have maybe received a couple of phone calls here and there, but for the most part, there's no attorney involvement. There's no know your rights. There's no access to representation. There's no meaningful ability to put forth their claims. So we're seeing a lot of people just summarily deported through those programs. And then on top of that, you have these ACAs, or these asylum collaborative agreements, where the United States has essentially strong-armed Central American countries into agreeing to receive asylum seekers and process the claims there. Because if you fled El Salvador, then for sure you'll be safe in Guatemala, because they have the ability to provide protection, which simply isn't true. We're sending asylum seekers back to the regions that they fled, where they're vulnerable to harm, to countries that, quite frankly, don't have the infrastructure or the ability to provide meaningful protection to asylum seekers. And so it's themes that the government, has just put forth a whole bunch of different ways, maybe understanding that they're all going to be challenged, and some of them will maybe be struck down by the courts, and then they'll pivot to some of these other really dreadful programs. So we're litigating along with some partners those asylum collaborative agreements. There's lots of litigation around the transit ban, around MPP, around all of these things, but everything is still in flux, and at present, the government is able to do maximum damage to asylum seekers.
Thank you. And Azadeh, maybe you can step off with this next question. It's about unaccompanied children again. And so you mentioned, that they're being expelled. Do we have any information about what's happening to them after they're expelled? Are they being sheltered in Mexico? Do we know any partners that are following up with that? Or, Lisa, feel free to jump in too.
So the tragedy of what's happening to children is that really we don't know what they've been, what they've been returned to. The harm that they've been returned to. The reason why in 2008 Congress passed protection to essentially mandate 3 different agencies to collaborate with each other to ensure safe repatriation is that it's incredibly hard, right, to track down children after they have been turned away and make sure that they are safe. So what short-circuiting that process has meant for children is really, it's a horrifying question mark, right? Like, we don't know what has happened to those hundreds of children, and we don't know what harms they have had to encounter. With that said, we recently have connected with migrant shelters in Mexico and gave a presentation to a number of different shelter providers, including for immigrant children. So we're trying to spread the word and to really collaborate to the extent possible. But part of this, the difficulty of this pandemic is that we are also restricted in what we can do in terms of our outreach and ability to research what's happening to these kids.
Thank you. There were a couple questions about the number of COVID cases in detention, and so I just wanted to clarify this actually, based on the slides, that 869 cases are confirmed as of the 11th of May, and approximately 1,700 have been tested. And so that's more than 50% of the people have been tested positive. And that's why, as Lisa and Azadeh suggested, that's why these doctors are calling detention centers these tinder boxes or the hotspots. So I just wanted to clarify that, as we had a number of questions on that. And I think we have time for one more question. Or does anybody, Mary Meg, did you want to say anything? Or Lisa or Azadeh, did you want to say any last minute thing? Okay. Oh, Mary Meg, I think you're muted.
Thank you. I would just say thank you. I mean, we could not do this alone, and we are grateful for all the attendance today. information is power, and it's so important that people stay informed and speak out as to what's happening. This is not what our country is about, and we have basic laws, fundamental protections, and we believe in human rights, and we've been a leader in human rights throughout the world. And somehow we all have to fight for that now more than ever. So thank you for joining us, and I hope you will join us on June 2nd for our virtual happy hour at 5 o'clock. All you need to do is register, it's free, and celebrate with us the heroes, the leaders of human rights today, and let's continue to be inspired and move forward in the work that my colleagues at NIJC are doing, that all of you are doing who are on this call, and our pro bono attorneys. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. As she said, there is a survey here, and the remaining questions we will follow up in an email. And so thank you for your participation, and thank you to all those that continue to do this great work. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.
Bye-bye.